Collector's Item by Evelyn E. Smith. Part 2. If only I hadn't gone and blasted that damn rock, the captain grumbled, squeezing water out of his shirt tails. We'd have been all right. Probably the storm wouldn't have done a thing to the ship except get it wet, if you can even call it a storm. I can and I do, Tran Pitt replied, haughtily, squeeging his wet scales. All I said was that a storm might be coming up and it might be dangerous. How was I to know it would last only half an hour? Even the camp stools pulled through, Greenfield pointed out. And you said shelters wouldn't stand up. I only said they might not. Can't you understand your own language? The fissure in the clouds had not quite closed yet, and through it the enormous blazing disk of the sun glared at them, twice as large as it appeared from Earth. It was a moot point as to whether they'd be dried out or steamed alive first. Might as well collect whatever gear we have left and get it to higher ground, Miss Anspetcher said efficiently. 2 feet of water won't do anything any good, even those camp stools. It's my belief you wanted this to happen, Greenfield accused Dran Pitt. You wanted to get rid of us. My dear fellow, Dran Pitt replied loftily, the information I gave you was, to the best of my knowledge, accurate. However, I happen to be a professor of zoology and not a meteorologist. Apparently you people live out in the open like primitives, he continued, ignoring Tva Lil's admiring interjection, and are accustomed to the vicissitudes of weather. I am a civilized creature. I live, or used to live, in an air-conditioned, light-conditioned, weather-conditioned city. It is only when I rough it on field trips like this to trackless parts of the globe that I'm forced to experience weather. Even then, I have never before been caught in a situation like this. In fact, I was never before caught, or I wouldn't be in this situation at all. Oh, Dran Pitt, sighed Miss Anspetcher. I knew you couldn't be just an ordinary native. How did you get into this situation, then? Professor Bernardi asked. He had an unfortunate talent for going directly to the point. The 3rd member of our expedition died, Dran Pitt explained. He was our dirigational expert, our guide. How did he happen to? Are we going to stand here chatting, Miss Anspert demanded, or are we going to do something about this? What can we do? Mrs. Bernardi asked weakly. We might as well lie down and... Never say die, Louisa, Miss Anspetcher admonished. I suggest we go to my camp to see what shape it's in, Dran Pitt said furiously, putting together Plan C. Some of the supplies there might prove useful. Captain Greenfield looked questioningly at Bernardi. The professor shrugged. Might as well. All right, the captain growled. Let's pick up whatever we can save. Since there wasn't much that could be rescued, the little safari was soon on its way. Dran Pitt led, carrying Algol in his arms. Behind came Mortlin, bearing a camp stool and the kettle, into which he had tucked a tin of biscuits and into which the mosquito bat had tucked itself. its orange eyes glaring out angrily from beneath the lid. Next came Mrs. Bernardi with her knitting, her camp stool, and her sorrow. Tfa Lil with 2 stools and the plastic tea set. Close behind was Miss Anspatcher with the sugar bowl, the earthenware teapot, and an immense bound volume of The Proceedings of the Physical Society for Amarangulus for 1993. Professor Bernardi bore a briefcase full of notes and the table. The rain had damaged the latter's mechanism so that its legs kept unfolding from time to time, to the great inconvenience of Captain Greenfield, who brought up the rear with the blasting equipment. Behind them, and sometimes alongside them, came something or someone else. Surely your camp must have been closer to ours than this, Miss Anspatcher finally remarked, after they had been slogging through mud and water and pushing aside reluctant vegetation for over an Earth hour.
I'm very much afraid,
Joanne Pitt admitted,
that our camp has been lost. That is to say, inundated.
What are we going to do now? The captain asked of the company at large. Professor Bernardi shrugged. Our only course would seem to be making for one of the cities and throwing ourselves upon the Rand Pitt's people's hospitality. If Professor Rand Pitt has even the vaguest idea of the direction in which his home lies, we might as well head that way. I wonder whether the natives could help us raise the ship.
I'm sure my people will be more than happy to welcome you,
Rand Pitt said smoothly,
and to make you comfortable until your people send another ship to fetch you.
The Terrestrials looked at one another. Tfa Lul looked at Rand Pitt. Professor Bernardi coughed. That was the only spaceship we had, he admitted. The first experimental model, you know. We don't expect to stay on this awful planet forever. After all, as Louisa says, the government will have to forgive us. Public opinion and all that.
Oh,
the Saurian said.
Then we shall have the pleasure of your company until they build another?
There was silence. We have the only plans, the professor said, gripping his briefcase more tightly. I'm the inventor of the ship, so naturally I would have them. If we brought back some specimens of Venusian life, of intelligent Venusian life, to prove we'd been here.
Matter of fact, old fellow, Mortland said, we took all the plans with us so they couldn't build another ship and follow.
Mortland! Professor exclaimed. But they're telepaths, Miss Anspatcher said. They must know already. Everyone turned to look at the Saurians.
I have certain information, Rand Pitt admitted, but I cannot understand it. You are in trouble with your rulers because they would not give you the funds, claiming space travel was impossible?
That's right, Bernardi said. Not really specimens, you understand. Guests.
And you went ahead and appropriated the funds and material from your government since you were in a trusted position where you could do so.
Bernardi nodded.
Of course, the question is now academic, for the ship is gone, but since you proved this possibility of space travel by coming here, wouldn't your government then dismiss the charges against you?
That's exactly what I keep telling him, Mrs. Bernardi exclaimed. But her husband shook his head. The law is inflexible. We have broken it, and it must be punished, even if by breaking it we proved its fundamental error.
Why let him know our plans?
Why, Dran Pitt, that sounds just like our own government, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
We should be able to establish a very satisfactory mode of living with these strangers.
We'd hoped after a year or two the whole thing would die down, Mortland explained frankly, and we'd go back as heroes.
Do you know the way to your home, Dran Pitt? The professor asked anxiously.
Since we were able to catch a glimpse of the sun, I think I can figure out roughly where we are. All we must do is walk some 200 kilometers in that direction.
He waved an arm to indicate the way.
And we should be at the capital.
Will your people accept us as refugees? Miss Anspatcher demanded bluntly. Or will we be captives? Which is what I bet the good professor is planning for you, if only he can figure some way to get you and, of course, ourselves back.
We should be proud to accept you as citizens and to receive the benefits of your splendid technology. Our laboratories will be placed at your disposal.
Well, that's better than we hoped for, the professor said, brightening. We had expected to have to carve out our own laboratories out of the wilderness. Now we shall be able to carry on our researches in comfort. No need to trouble the natives. We'll be able to raise the ship ourselves or buy a new one, and I'll see to it personally that they have a special quarters in the zoo with a considerable amount of privacy.
If I were you, I wouldn't trust him too far, the captain warned. He's a foreigner.
You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Captain, Miss Anspatcher said. I, for one, trust Dran Pitt implicitly. Did you say this direction, Dran Pitt? She stepped forward briskly. There was a loud splash and water closed over her head. Captain Greenfield rushed forward to haul her out. Well, she said, daintily coughing up mud. I was wet to begin with anyway.
You're a brave little woman, Miss Anspatcher, the captain told her admiringly.
This sort of thing may present a problem, Professor Bernardi commented. I hope that was only a pothole, that the water is not going to be consistently too deep for wading. There might be quicksand, too, Mrs. Bernardi said somberly. In quicksand, one drowns slowly. Farlow gave a start.
Surely you don't intend to lead them back to base? Precisely. The swamp is unfit for settlement. But to return voluntarily to captivity? Who mentioned anything about captivity? Assisted by our new friends, we have an excellent chance of taking over the ship and supplies by a surprise attack. But why should these aliens assist us?
Dran Pitt smiled.
Oh, I think they will. Yes, I have every confidence in Plan C.
I suggest, the professor said, ignoring his wife's pessimism, that each one of us pull a branch from a tree. We can test the ground before we step on it to make sure that there is solid footing underneath.
Good idea, the captain approved.
He reached out the arm that was not occupied with Miss Anspatcher and tugged at a tree limb. And then he and the lady physicist were both floundering in the ooze.
Well, really, Captain Greenfield, she cried, refusing his aid in extricating herself. I always thought you were at least a gentleman in spite of your illiteracy.
What happened? He asked as he struggled out of the mud.
Something pushed me, I swear it.
Dran Pitt mentalized.
It seems the tree did not like you to remove a branch.
The tree?
Greenfield's pale eyes bulged.
You're joking.
Not at all.
As a matter of fact, I myself have been wondering why there were so many thought streams and yet so few animals around here. It never occurred to me that the vegetation could be sentient and have such strong emotive defenses. In all my experience as a botanist, I thought you were a zoologist, Bernardi interrupted. My people do not believe in excessive specialization, the Saurian replied. Trees that think? Mortlin inquired incredulously. They're not very bright, Dran Pitt explained, but they don't like having their limbs pulled off. I don't suppose you would either, for that matter. I propose, Miss Ansbacher said, shaking out her wet hair, that we break up the camp stools and use the sticks instead of the branches to help us along. Good idea, the captain said, trying to get back into her good graces. I always knew women could put their brains to use if they tried. She glared at him. I thought we'd use the furniture to make a fire later, Mortlin complained. For tea, you know. The ground is much too wet, Professor Bernardi replied. And besides, Miss Ansbacher added, I lost the teapot in the pothole. But you managed to save the proceedings of the Physical Society? Mortlin snarled. Serves you right if I eat it, and I warn you, if hard-pressed, I shall. How will we cook our food, though? Miss Bernardi demanded apprehensively. It's a lucky thing, Mr. Pitt, that we have you with us to tell us which of the berries and things are edible, so at least we shan't starve. The visible portion of Dran Pitt's well-knit form turned deeper green. But I regret to say I don't know, Mrs. Bernardi. Those native foods I served you were all synthetics from our personal stores. I've never tasted natural foods before I met you. And if the trees don't like us taking their branches, Miss Ansbacher put in, I don't suppose the bushes would like our taking their berries. Louisa, don't do that. But Mrs. Bernardi, with her usual disregard for orders, had fainted into the mud. Pulling her out and reviving her caused so much confusion. It wasn't until then that they discovered Algol had disappeared. The party had been trudging through mud and water and struggling with pale, malevolent vines and bushes and low-hanging branches for close to 6 Earth hours. All of them were tired and hungry now that their meagre supply of biscuits and chocolate was gone. Remember, Carl? Mrs. Bernardi told her husband, I forgive you, and I know I'm being foolishly sentimental, but if you could manage to take my body back to Earth... Don't be so pessimistic, Professor Bernardi absent-mindedly leaned against a tree and then recoiled as he remembered it might resent being treated like an inanimate object. In any case, we'll most likely die all at the same time. I never did want to go to Venus, really, Mrs. Bernardi sniffled. I only came like Algol did because I didn't have any choice. If you left me behind, I'd have to bear the brunt of... Where is Algol? She stared at Dran Pitt. You were carrying him. What have you done with him? The lizard man looked at her in consternation. He jumped out of my arms when you fainted, and I turned back to help. I was certain one of the others had him. He's dead, she wailed. You let him fall into the water and drown. An innocent kitty that never hurt anybody except in fun. Come, Louisa. Her husband took her arm. He was only a cat. I'm sure Dran Pitt didn't mean for him to drown. He was just so upset by your fainting that he didn't think... Not Dran Pitt's fault, of course, Miss Ansbacher said. After all,
We can't expect them to love animals as we do, but Algol was a very good sort of cat.
Keep quiet, all of you,
Jan Prit shouted.
I have never known any species to use any method of communication so much in order to communicate so little. Don't you understand? I would not have assumed the cat was with one of you if I had not subconsciously sensed his thought stream all along. He must be nearby.
Everyone was still while Jan Prit probed the dense underbush and blocked their view on both sides.
Over here,
he announced, and led the way through the thick screen of interlaced bushes and vines on the left. About 10 meters further on, the ground sloped up sharply to form a ridge, rising 1.5 meters above the rest of the terrain. The water had not reached its blunted top, and on this fairly level strip of ground, perhaps 3 meters wide, Algol had been paralleling their path in dry-pawed comfort. Scientists, Louisa Bernardi almost spat. Professors! We could have been walking on that too, but did anybody think to look for dry ground? No. It was wet in one place, so it would be wet in another. Oh, Algol! She reached over to embrace the cat. You're smarter than any so-called intelligent life forms. He indignantly straightened a whisker she had crumpled. Look, Mortland exclaimed in delight as they attained the top of the ridge. Here are some dryish twigs. Don't suppose the trees want them, since they've let them fall. If I can get a fire going, we could boil some swamp water and make tea. Nasty thought, but it's better than no tea at all. And how long can one go on living without tea? We'll need some food before long, too, Professor Bernardi observed, putting his briefcase down on a fallen log. The usual procedure, I believe, would be for us to draw straws to see which gets eaten, although there isn't any hurry. I'm glad, then, that we'll be able to have a fire, Mortland said, busily collecting twigs. I should hate to have to eat you raw, Carl. Mr. Pitt and his little friend are delightful creatures, Mrs. Bernardi thought. So intelligent and so well behaved. But eating them wouldn't really be cannibalism. They aren't people.
That premise works both ways, dear lady, Tran Pitt ideated. And I must say your species will provide far easier to peel for the cooking pot. Monster, what are you doing? Mortland dropped his twigs and pulled the mosquito bat away from a bush. Don't eat those berries, you silly ass. The bush won't like it. The mosquito bat piped wrathfully. Tran Pitt probed with intentness. You know, I rather think the bush wants its berries to be eaten. Something to do with, propagating itself. Of course, it has a false impression as to what it's going to be done with the berries, but the important fact is that it won't put up any resistance.
All right, old fellow. Mortland released the mosquito bat, which promptly flew back to the bush. I'm not the custodian of your morals. I wonder whether we could eat those berries too, Professor Bernardi remarked pensively. Carl, Mrs. Bernardi's tear-stained face flushed pink. Why, that's most indecent. We eat beans, don't we? Mortland pointed out. They're seeds. We also eat meat, Miss Ann Spatcher added. There was silence. I imagine, Miss Bernardi mumbled, it's because we never get to meet the meat socially. She avoided the Saurian's eyes. We better see how Monster makes out, though, Miss Ann Spatcher observed, replenishing her lipstick, before we try the berries ourselves. The fact that the bush is anxious to dispose of them doesn't mean they can't be poisonous. Why should monster sacrifice himself for us? Mortland retorted hotly, overlooking the fact that Monster's purpose in eating the berries was almost certainly not an altruistic one. If we can risk his life, we can risk our own. He crammed a handful of berries into his mouth defiantly. I say, they're good. Algol sniffed the bush with disgust, then turned away. See, said Miss Anspatcher, they're undoubtedly poisonous. When he's really hungry, he isn't so fussy. She combed her hair. But is he really hungry? Bernardi asked suspiciously. Come here, Algol. Nice kitty. He bent down and sniffed the cat's breath. The cat sniffed his interestedly. Their whiskers touched. I thought so. Fish. You mean, Miss Bernardi shrieked, that while we're struggling through that water, alternatively starving and drowning by centimeters, that wretched cat has not only been walking along here dry as toast, but gorging himself on fish?
Now, Miss Bernardi, Shranpit said. Being a dumb animal, he wouldn't think of informing you about matters of which he'd assumed that you, as the superior beings, would be fully cognizant.
You might have told us there were fish on this planet, Mr. Pitt.
Dear lady, there is something I feel I should tell you. I'm not...
They're here, on the other side of the ridge, Greenfield called, bending over and peering through the foliage. The fish, I mean. The pools look shallow, Bernardi said, also bending over. The fish should be easy enough to catch. Might even be able to get them in our hands. He reached out to demonstrate, proving the error of both his thesis. For the fish slipped right through his fingers, and as he grabbed for them, he lost his balance, toppled over the side of the ridge into the mud and the water below, and began to disappear, showing beyond a doubt that the pools were deeper than he had thought. Carl, what are you doing? Miss Bernardi peered into the murky depths where her husband was threshing about. Why don't you come out of that filthy mud? His voice, though muffled, was still acid. It isn't mud, my dear, it's quicksand. Rope! The captain exclaimed, grabbing a coil. Hold on, chaps, cried a squeaky voice. I'm coming to the rescue. A stout 12-foot vine plunged out of the shadows and wrapped one end of itself around a tree, disregarding the latter's violent objections, and the other end around Professor Bernardi's thorax, which was disappearing into the mud. Now, if one or two of you would haul away, we'll soon have him out all ship-shape and proper. Heave-ho! Don't be afraid of hurting me. My strength is the strength of 10, because my heart is pure.
It's that vine,
Tfarlul exclaimed.
So, that is what has been following us all along.
I can accept the idea of a vegetable thinking, Professor Bernardi gasped as he was pulled out of the quicksand. Although, with the utmost reluctance, he shook himself like a dog. But how can it be mobile? You chaps can move around, the vine explained. So I said to myself, damn it, I'll have a shot at doing that too. Hard going at first when you're using suckers, but I persevered and I made it. Look, I can talk too. Never heard of a vine doing that before, did you? Fact is, I hadn't thought of it before, but then I never had anyone to communicate with. All those other vines are so stupid. You have absolutely no idea. Hope you don't mind me picking up your language, but it was the only one around. We're honored, Professor Bernardi declared, and I am deeply grateful to you, too, sir or madam, for saving my life. Think nothing of it, the vine said, arranging its leaves which were of a pleasing celadon rather than the whitish green favoured by the rest of the local vegetation. Now that I can move, I'll probably be doing heroic things like that all the time. Are you going to the city? May I go with you? I've heard lots about the city. It went on, taking consent for granted. But I never thought I'd get to see it. Everybody in the swamp is such an old stick in the mud. I thought I was trapped too, forced to spend the rest of my life in a provincial environment. Is it true that the streets are filled with chlorophyll? Do you think I can get a job in a botanical garden or something? Perhaps I can give little talks on horticulture to visitors. The mosquito bat looked out of the tea kettle austerely. Monster, it piped shrilly. The very idea, the vine snapped back indignantly. Oh well, it said, calming down. You probably don't know any better. It's up to me as the intelligent life form to forgive you, and I shall. Shran Pitt and Devar looked at each other in consternation.
Do you think there really are cities on this planet, sir? Can there be indigenous intelligent life? If so, it may have already got in touch with the commandant. Impossible, Shran Pitt replied. The vine probably just heard us talking about a city. After all, it picked up the language that way. Very likely it absorbs some terrestrial concepts along with it. If there are any real settlements at all, they must be quite primitive, nothing more than villages. No, it's we who will build the cities on Venus, combining our technology with the terrestrials. We could develop a pretty little civilization here, after we've disposed of the commandant, so he can't report our disappearance. We don't want any publicity. So much better to keep our little society exclusive.
Wonder what the time is, the captain remarked as he rose and stretched in the dim yellow light of the long Venusian day. Must have slept for hours. My watch seems to have stopped. Mine too. Mortland unstrapped his from his wrist and shook it futilely. Waterproof, huh? If we ever get back to Earth, I shall make the manufacturer eat his guarantee. Oh well, what does time matter to us now? Professor Bernardi pointed out as he rose from his leafy couch with a loud creak. All of them, even the saurians, had aches and pains in every joint and muscle as a result of the unaccustomed exercise and the damp climate. We are out of its reach. It has no present meaning for us. This depressed them all. Only the vine seemed in good health and spirits. I notice you're all wearing clothes except for the short four-legged gentleman with the homegrown fur coat. It chattered happily. Do you think I'll be socially acceptable without them? I wouldn't want to make a bad impression at the very start, or would leaves do? Everybody looked at Shran Pitt.
We are not a narrow-minded species, he said hastily. I'm sure your leaves will be more than adequate.
After a breakfast of fish and berries stewed in tea, which the vine declined with thanks, the various members of the party gathered up their belongings and resumed their journey. Encrusted with dried purple mud and grime, their clothes deliberately torn by antisocial shrubbery, their chins, of the males that is, disfigured by hirsute growths, the terrestrials made a sorry spectacle. It was hot, boiling hot, and more humid than ever. Well, said Miss Anspatcher, letting the Swahili marching song with which she had been attempting to encourage the company peter out. I do hope we'll reach your city soon, Shran Pitt. I must say I could use a hot bath. She added hastily, hot baths are a peculiar cultural trait of ours.
I could use one myself,
Shran Pitt said. He brushed his scales fastidiously. I'm looking forward to meeting your relatives, she said, grabbing his left arm determinedly. I'm not violating a taboo or anything, am I? It isn't really slimy. It just feels that way.
Not of my people's, but I'm afraid you're violating a terrestrial taboo, judging from the thoughts I pick up from your captain's mind.
Oh, him. He's a stupid fool.
Not at all. Rough, perhaps. Untutored, yes. But with a good deal of native intelligence, although fearfully primitive.
Perhaps I was too harsh, Miss Anne Spatcher observed thoughtfully. The captain is good-looking in a brutal sort of way, although not nearly as handsome or even as spiritual in appearance as Jean Pitt, and sometimes I almost think he, she blushed to herself, shows a certain partiality for my company. She did not, however, let go of the Saurian's arm when the captain bustled up, preparing to put a stop to this, but tactfully, if possible, for he had begun to realize that his rude ways did not endear him to her.
Ah, we're making very good progress, aren't we, Pitt? He interrupted, trying to insinuate himself between the two.
Excellent.
How soon do you think we'll be at your city at this rate?
Jean Pitt shrugged. Since I have no way of telling what our rate is or how far we have gone, how can I tell? As a matter of fact, you might as well learn now as later. I'm not a Venusian. There is no intelligent life native to Venus.
Oh, really? The Vine interposed indignantly. Saying a thing like that right in front of me. What would you call me then, pray tell?
Jean Pitt kept his actual thoughts to himself. A mutation, he said. Probably you are the first intelligent life form to appear on this planet. Scholarly volumes will be written about you.
Oh? The Vine seemed to be appeased. I accept your apology. Perhaps I'll learn to write and do the books myself, because I'm the only one who can understand the real me.
But how can you show us the way to your city if you're not native to Venus? Bernardi demanded, whirling fretfully upon the Saurian. What is this, anyway? Each time you've come up with a different story.
See, said the captain, didn't I tell you he was up to no good?
I should like to lead you to our base,
Jean Pitt replied with quiet dignity.
I'm telling you the truth now, since I feel I should have your consent before proceeding further.
Huh? Tfa Lil projected.
I hesitated before because I wasn't sure I could trust you. You see, the spaceship in which we came to this planet is a prison ship, with a crew consisting of malefactors, thieves, murderers, defrauders, dispatched to the remote vastness of the galaxy to fetch back zoological specimens. Our zoo, I must say, is the finest and most interesting in the universe.
Monster! The mosquito bat squeaked.
Shh! Mortland admonished. Don't interrupt.
I was in command of our ill-fated expedition. Oh,
Tfa Phil projected.
For a moment there, sir, you had me worried. When we reached Venus, I was, I must admit, careless. I gave the crew a chance to mutiny, and they did. Slew most of the officers. Farrell and I were lucky to escape with our lives.
But you might have told us. Mrs. Bernardi's voice held reproach.
Until we knew what kind of beings you were, we couldn't let you know how helpless and unprotected we were.
The women seemed moved, but not the men.
Leading us on a wild goose chase, were you? The captain challenged.
Jean Pitt drew a deep breath.
It was my hope that all of you would consent to help us get our ship back back from these criminals. Then we could fly to my planet, which is the 5th star you know as Alpha Centauri, where I assure you will be hospitably received. We aren't going back home, John Pitt, are we? I'd sooner stay here in the swamp than go back to that jail. Have confidence in me, Earl. As soon as we have disposed of the Commandant and his officers, I can put our ship out of commission. The Terrestrials won't be able to tell what's wrong. They know nothing about space travel. The fact that they got their crude vessel to operate was probably sheer luck.
But the younger was not to be diverted.
Will we kill them after we've disposed of our officers? I should hate to. Certainly not. We shall need servants, and I don't trust the prisoners in the ship. All criminals of the lowest type.
Aloud, he said to the bewildered Terrestrials,
If you don't want to help us, I shall understand. No sense your interfering in another species' quarrels, particularly as we must seem like monsters to you.
Monster, the mosquito bat agreed. Monster, monster, monster. No one tried to stop him. Shran Pitt sensed that somehow he had lost a good deal of his grip on the Terrestrials. Finesse, he thought angrily, was wasted on these barbaric life forms. Bernardi sighed. I suppose we'll have to help you. No reason why his ship shouldn't stop off at Earth before it goes to Alpha Centauri. No reason why it should even go to Alpha Centauri at all, in fact. If you ask me, the captain said, he is one of the criminals himself. But nobody asked you, Miss Anspatcher retorted, the more acidly, because she had been wondering the same thing. Shall we resume our journey? Hold on, the Vine said. I don't want to intrude or anything, but it hasn't been quite made clear to me whether or not I'm included in the invitation to this Alpha Centauri place, and I wouldn't want to keep on going on the off chances that you might ask me. I really think you should, because you led me astray with your fair promises of glittering cities.
The cities of our planet do not glitter,
Shran Pitt replied, wishing it would wither instantly.
But certainly you are invited. Glad to have you.
Oh, that's awfully decent of you, the Vine said emotionally. I shan't forget it, I promise you. They plodded onwards, the Vine chattering so incessantly that a faint gurgling which accompanied them went unnoticed. The gurgling grew louder and louder as they pushed on. Finally,
I keep hearing water,
Mortland remarked.
We must be approaching a river of some kind.
A few minutes later, bursting through a screen of underbrush, they found themselves confronted by a river whose bubbling, violet-blue waters extended for at least 4 kilometres from shadowy bank to bank, with the ridge tapering to a point almost in its exact centre. Apparently, while they had been trekking along the elevation, the surrounding terrain, concealed from them by the dense and evil-minded vegetation, had imperceptibly taken off, leaving the ridge to become a peninsula that jutted out into the river. They seemed to be stranded. All they could do was retrace their steps, and since they had no idea how far back the split became part of the mainland again, the return journey might last as long as it had taken them to get there.
I know we're heading in the right direction,
Shran Pitt defended himself.
I wasn't aware of the river because we must have come by an overland route.
Although he was telling the truth, at least insofar as he knew it himself, no one, not even Defar Lil, believed him.
But let's rest a bit before we turn back, Mortland proposed, flopping to the ground. I'm utterly used up.
Maybe we don't need to go back, the Vine said. Not all the way, anyhow. Everyone stared. It waved its leaves brightly at them. I noticed the captain thoughtfully brought along lots of rope, and there were scads of fallen logs just a bit back. Couldn't you just lash the logs together with a rope and make a thing on which we could float the rest of the way on the water, you know? The others continued to look at it open-mouthed. Just a little idea I had, it said modestly. May not amount to much, but then you can't tell until you've tried, can you? He means a raft, I think, Mrs. Bernardi said. Shran Pitt probed the raft concept in her mind, for he found the vegetable's mental processes curiously obscure.
What an excellent idea,
he exclaimed. It does not seem infeasible, Professor Bernardi admitted tightly. By now he was suspicious of everyone and everything. If I had never broached the idea of space travel to these peasants, he thought, I would be on Earth in the dubious comfort of my own home. That's what comes of trying to help humanity. Well, observed the captain, as the heavy raft hit the water with a tremendous splash. She seems to be river-worthy. He rubbed his hands in anticipation, much of his surliness gone, now that he was about to deal with something he understood. Since she is, in a manner of speaking, a ship, I suppose I assume command again. He waited for objections, glancing involuntarily in Shran Pitt's direction. There were none. Right, he said, repressing any outward symptoms of relief. He efficiently deployed the personnel to the positions on the raft where he felt they might be least useless, the gear being piled in the middle and surmounted by Algol, who naturally assumed possession of the softest and safest place by the divine right of cats. The captain does have a commanding presence, Miss Anspatcher thought, and a sort of uncouth grace. Moreover, he cannot read my mind. In fact, he often cannot even understand me when I speak. All right, he bellowed, cast off. The vine unfastened the rope that it had insouciantly attached to a tree trunk, remarking to the others, Don't let the trees intimidate you. Actually, their bark is worse than their bite. Now it dropped lively on board the raft, looking for a comfortable resting place. Please don't twine around me, Miss Anspatcher said coldly. If you insist upon coming with us, you will have to choose an inanimate object to cling to. All right, it tried to soothe her. No need to get yourself all worked up over such a mere triviality, is there? I'll just coil myself tidily around one of those spare logs. I must say you're warmer, though. Yes, she is, isn't she? Thought the captain, and squeezed her hand. The raft drifted down the river. Since the current was flowing in the desired direction, there did not appear to be any need to use the poles, and everyone sat or reclined as comfortably as possible in the suffocating heat. The yellow haze had become so thick that they seemed to be at the bottom of a custard cup. I do hope we're heading the right way, Professor Bernardi said, although who knows what is right and what is wrong anymore. Perhaps we aren't, Miss Bernardi mused, stroking Algol, who had crawled into her laps. Perhaps we will go on drifting along endlessly. Every 16 days it will get dark, and every 16 days it'll get light, and meanwhile we'll continue floating along, never going anywhere, never getting anywhere, never seeing anything but haze and raft and river and each other. Algol wheezed in his sleep.
Nonsense,
Shran Pitt said rudely.
I have a compass. I know the direction perfectly well.
And yet you let us think we're wandering about blindly? Miss Anspatcher gave him a contemptuous look. The captain pressed her hand. Since you seem to breathe the same air and eat much the same food that we do, Mr. Pitt, Miss Bernardi changed her tack. I suppose we'll be physically comfortable on your planet for the rest of our lives. Our children will be born there, and our children's children, and eventually they'll forget all about Earth and think it was only a legend. But you did expect to settle permanently on Venus, didn't you? The Vine asked bewilderedly. Or for a long visit anyway. So I don't really see that it makes a difference if you go to Dran Pat's Alpha Centauri place. So much nicer to be living with friends, I should think. But Alpha Centauri is so very far away, Miss Bernardi sighed. There wouldn't be much of a chance of our ever getting back.
Look, Mortland exclaimed. The river's branching. Which fork do we take?
Dran Pitt, who had been dabbling his arms idly in the translucent violet-blue water, withdrew them hastily as 9 green eyes, obviously belonging to the same individual, rose to the surface and regarded him with more than casual interest. He consulted his compass.
Left.
Contrarily, the mosquito bat suddenly squeaked, pointing a small rod at his companions. Rightward. There was a stunned silence.
Monster? Mortland cried in reproach. You can talk? How could you deceive us like that?
Can talk, the creature retorted. Me not intelligent life form. Ha! Who talks last talks best. Have not linguistic facility of inferior life form, but can communicate rudely in your language.
Remember, Mortland cautioned, there are ladies present.
Have been lying low and laughing to self, ha ha, at witlessness of lowerly life forms. But why? Mrs. Bernardi demanded distractedly. Haven't we been kind to you? You be likewise treated in our zoo, it assured her. All of you, our zoo, finest in galaxy, and clean, too.
Now, really, sir, I must protest.
Professor Bernardi began trying to extricate a blaster unobtrusively from the pile of gear in which the 2 confident terrestrials had cached their weapons. Monster gestured with his rod. This is lethal weapon. Do not try hindrancing me. Hate damage fine specimen. Captain, go rightward.
Oh, is that so? Greenfield retorted hotly. Let me tell you, you insect.
George, Miss Anspatcher clutched his arm. Do what it says for my sake, George.
Oh, all right, he muttered. Just for you, then. Told you not to trust any of them.
He went on, reluctantly poling the raft in the ordered direction.
Foreigners.
Fine zoo, the mosquito bat insisted. Very clean, run with utmost efficientness. Strict visiting hours. And there goes Plan D, the Vine said lightly. There was a hint of laughter in its voice. Dran Pitt stared at it in consternation. Are you also from the Alpha Centauri system, sir? It turned its attention to the mosquito bat. Naturally, I'm curious to know where I'm going, it explained, since I seem definitely to be included in your gracious invitation. Alpha Centauri! Ha! The mosquito bat snorted. I, from what Earthlets laughingly term Sirius. Alpha Centauri merely little star.
Now, see here.
Dran Pitt sprang to his feet. Criminal he might be, but he was not going to sit there and have his son insulted. Gentlemen, gentlemen, Miss Anspatcher cried. No use getting yourself killed, Dran Pitt. Correctly, Monster approved. Elementary intelligence displayed. Why damage fine specimens?
From one prison into another,
the Saurian mentalized bitterly.
Yes, returned Draff. Ugh. And it's all your fault.
The junior lizard burst into tears.
I wish I had let Murgo do what he wanted. I would have been better off.
Sirius? The Vine repeated. That is even farther away than Alpha Centauri, isn't it? I never thought I would get that far away from the swamp. This really will be an adventure.
How do you know? Professor Bernardi began.
Frankly, it went on, I don't see why you chaps are so put out by the whole thing. What's the difference between Alpha Centauri and Sirius anyway? Matter of a few light years, but otherwise a star's a star for all that.
To Dran Pitt, we would have all been specimens, Mrs. Bernardi said, belatedly recognizing the advantages of Alpha Centauri.
No, not specimens, the Vine told her easily. I don't suppose you know he had no intention of taking you back to his system. He wanted you to help him kill the officers of his ship so they couldn't look for him and the other escaped prisoner or report back to his planet. Then he was going to put the ship out of commission and found his own colony here with you as his slaves. I'd just as soon be a specimen as a slave. Sooner. Better to reign in a zoo than serve in a swamp.
Just how do you know all of this? Miss Anspatcher demanded. It's obvious enough, Bernardi said gloomily. Another telepath. How can we compete or even cope with creatures like these? What a fool I was to think I could outwit them.
Telepathy, just tricksomeness, the mosquito bat put in jealously. I have no telepathy, yet superior to all.
But why should Mr. Pitt want to kill his officers? Miss Bernardi asked querulously. He's the commandant, isn't he? Or is he a professor? I never got that straight.
He was one of the criminals on the ship, the Vine told her. What you might call a confidence man. This is about the only system in the galaxy where he isn't wanted. He did tell you the truth, though, when he said they were sent on an expedition to collect zoological specimens. Dangerous work, it sighed. And so his people use criminals for it. They were sent out in small detachments. Our friend here killed his guard in a fight over a female prisoner, which is why...
But what happened to the female prisoner? Miss Anspatcher's eyes caught Defar Lil's. Oh no, she gasped.
Why not?
Defar Lil demanded.
I'm as much of a female as you are, maybe even more.
The captain leaned close to Miss Anspatcher. No one can be more feminine than you are, Dolores, he whispered.
But she's so young,
Miss Bernardi wailed. The Vine made an amused sound.
Don't you have juvenile delinquents on Earth?
Oh, what does it matter now?
Dran Pitt said sullenly.
We're all going to a Syrian zoo anyway.
Correctly, approved the monster bat. Finest zoo, clean, commodious cages, reasonable visiting hours. Very nice.
Miss Bernardi began to cry.
Now, the Vine comforted her, a zoo's not so bad. After all, most of us spend our life in cages of one kind or another, and without the basic security a zoo affords... But we don't know we're in cages, Miss Bernardi sobbed. That's the important thing.
Professor Bernardi looked at the Vine. But why are you... He began, then halted. Perhaps I don't want an answer, he said. There was no hope at all left in him, now that there was no doubt.
You are very wise, the Vine agreed quietly.
Algol rose from Mr. Bernardi's lap and rubbed against its thick pale green stem. He knew. The mosquito bat looked at them both restlessly. The yellow haze had deepened to old gold. Now it was beginning to turn brown.
It's twilight, Miss Anspatcher observed. Soon it will be dark.
Perhaps we'll sail right past his ship in the night, Mortland suggested hopefully. The mosquito bat gave a snort.
Ship has light. all modern convenience. Suddenly, the air seemed to have grown chilly, colder than it had any right to be on that torrid planet. All around them, it was dark and very quiet.
I think I do see lights, Mortland said.
Must be ship, Monster replied, and somehow the rest of them could sense the uneasiness in the thin, piping alien voice. Must be.
Your ship's a very large one, then, Bernardi commented as they rounded a bend and a whole colony of vari-coloured pastel lights sprang up ahead of them.
Not my ship, the mosquito bat exclaimed in a voice pierced with anguish. Not my ship. Before them rose the fantastic, twisting, convoluting, turning spires of a tall, marvellous, glittering city. You will find that the streets actually are filled with chlorophyll, the vine said, and I know you'll be happy here, all of you. You see, we can't have you go back to your planets now, no matter how good your intentions were. You'd destroy us. You see that, don't you?
You may be right, Bernardi agreed dispiritedly. Although that doesn't cheer us any. But what will you do with us?
You'll be provided with living quarters comparable to those on your own planet, the vine told him, and you'll give lectures just as if you were in a university, only you'll be much more secure, I assure you. Its voice was very gentle now. You'll hardly know you're in a zoo. The end. If you are enjoying these audiobooks, please take the time to subscribe, press like, leave a comment, or share this channel with your friends who also enjoy listening to audiobooks. Thank you.